the genetic signature. The instruction manual we never read. Let me tell you a small bedtime story. Imagine you give a child a very important book, not a picture book, not a fairy tale, an instruction manual. You tell them, this explains how everything works. The child opens it, looks at the cover, flips a few pages, then shrugs and says, most of this is blank. Probably useless. So they close the book and never read it again. My line, for decades. That's exactly how we treated human DNA. When scientists finally mapped the human genome, something we'd dreamed of for generations, they expected something neat, elegant, efficient, tightly written. Clear instructions for building a human. Instead, they got a shock. Only about 2% of our DNA seem to do anything obvious. Genes that code for proteins, traits, functions. The rest? A vast, silent ocean of genetic material. Repeating sequences, strange patterns. Segments that didn't seem to make proteins at all, so we gave it a name, a very human name. Junk DNA, and that should already make you uncomfortable. Because nature, if there's one thing it's famous for, isn't wasteful. Evolution trends relentlessly. Useless traits disappear. Inefficiencies get edited out over time. Every calorie matters. Every mutation has a cost, so here's the quiet problem. Why would a process obsessed with survival carry around a massive amount of apparently useless code? Not a little. Most of it. I know what you're thinking. Maybe we just don't understand it yet. Yes, exactly. And that's where this story starts to feel off. Because when engineers don't understand part of a system, they don't call it junk. They call it undocumented. Unused doesn't mean meaningless. Silent doesn't mean empty. Sometimes it just means you don't know what language it's written in. And here's the strange part. As our tools improved, that so-called junk started doing things. Regulating genes, switching functions on and off, responding to environment, stress, even thought. The blank pages weren't blank at all. They were instructions we didn't know how to read. Which leads to a question so simple it feels childish, but refuses to go away. If human DNA is an instruction manual, who wrote it so far ahead of our understanding? Because evolution explains change. It explains adaptation, but it struggles to explain sudden leaps. Especially when those leaps involve the most complex object we know in the universe, the human brain. So before we talk about aliens, before we talk about visitors, before we talk about interference, we have to sit with this quieter mystery. What if the most important evidence wasn't left in stone? Or buried in machines? What if it's been inside us the whole time, waiting patiently for us to finally stop calling it junk and start asking the question we avoided for decades? What were we not supposed to understand yet? The quiet code inside you. Let's slow this way down. No jargon, no lab coats, no microscopes required. DNA is a code. That's it. A long message written with only 4 letters, A, T, C, and G, not because nature is simple, but because simple alphabets can write very complicated stories. Every cell in your body carries this code, not just some cells. All of them. Your skin cells. Your brain cells. Your heart cells. Each one holds the entire instruction set for building you. My version, think of DNA like a recipe book that builds you from scratch every time. Cut your finger. The cells don't panic. They don't guess. They open the book. Find the page. Follow the instructions. Now here's the part that surprised everyone. When scientists finally learned how to read this book, they expected it to be packed. Page after page of clear instructions. Instead, they found something strange. Only about 2% of the human genome actually codes for proteins, the building blocks of your body, muscle fibers, enzymes, structural components. The stuff you can point to and say, that does something. The other 98%? It doesn't build proteins. It repeats. It loops. It switches things on and off. It responds to signals we're still trying to understand. Historically, scientists didn't know what to do with it, so they gave it labels. Junk DNA, leftovers, evolutionary noise. Put me aside. Calling something junk usually means we don't know what it does yet. It's a placeholder word. A shrug dressed up as confidence, because here's the uncomfortable truth. If 98% of a machine looked useless, you wouldn't assume the machine was badly designed. You'd assume you were missing the manual. Over time, that assumption started to crack. Researchers discovered that these non-coding regions are incredibly active. They regulate when genes turn on or off. They shape development. They respond to stress, environment, even behavior. They act less like spare parts and more like control software. Suddenly, the genome didn't look inefficient, it looked layered. Basic instructions up front, deeper systems underneath. Which raises a gentle but unsettling question. Why would evolution, famous for cutting anything unnecessary, keep so much complexity if it didn't matter? Why carry around miles of genetic code just to do nothing? Especially when copying DNA takes energy, maintaining it takes energy, repairing it takes energy. Nature doesn't like overhead. So maybe this isn't overhead, maybe it's infrastructure. Maybe what we call junk is more like comments in a codebase, fail-safes, version history, features we haven't unlocked yet. And if that's true, then the human genome isn't just a snapshot of where we came from. It might be a record of where we were meant to go. But before we get carried away, stay with me. We're not saying someone wrote DNA yet. We're saying something much smaller and harder to ignore. That the confidence with which we dismissed most of our own biology might have been premature. And if there is something unusual about our genetic code, something out of step with what evolution alone would predict, then the place to look wouldn't be in the loud, obvious parts. It would be in the quiet sections, the parts we skipped, the pages we decided were blank. Because sometimes the most important instructions aren't written in bold. They're written in the margins, waiting for the reader to finally grow into them. Isn't junk DNA just evolutionary baggage? Now, let's pause. Because this is where a very reasonable objection walks into the room, folds its arms and clears its throat. Isn't junk DNA just evolutionary baggage? Fair question. Evolution isn't a perfectionist, it reuses old code. It stacks mutations on top of mutations, it leaves scars. Not everything has to be optimized. I agree. That instinct to resist turning mystery into magic is healthy. My phrase. Now you might be thinking, okay, but evolution is messy. True, but even mess has patterns. So let's ask the quieter follow-up questions. If junk DNA is just useless leftovers, why is so much of it highly conserved? That means it stays the same across generations. Evolution is ruthless about deleting what doesn't matter. Yet large portions of non-coding DNA resist change. They're protected, as if altering them breaks something important. Second question, why is junk DNA species-specific? If it were random debris, we'd expect it to be similar across life. Instead, different species carry distinct non-coding regions, almost like unique operating systems layered on the same basic hardware. Third question, and this one matters. Why is junk DNA especially active during brain development? During the most complex, delicate process in human biology, building a mind, these regions light up. They regulate timing, they coordinate growth. They influence neural architecture. This isn't background noise. It's orchestration. So yes, evolution is messy. But it's not careless. It doesn't keep vast systems online for no reason. It doesn't guard what doesn't matter. Which forces us to consider a subtle shift in perspective. What if this isn't junk, but metadata? Not the instructions themselves, but instructions about the instructions, context, timing, conditions, the difference between build a house and build a house now here, with these materials under these conditions. Metadata doesn't look impressive. It doesn't make things directly, but without it, nothing complex works. And here's the strange part. The more we learn about these regions, the less random they seem. Patterns emerge. Regulatory logic appears. Interactions multiply. It's not chaos. It's layered complexity. Which brings us back to the same uncomfortable feeling we've been circling since the beginning of this book. That humanity's story might not be as simple as we told ourselves. Not because something magical happened, but because something quiet did. Something we dismissed because it didn't announce itself. So no, we don't need to throw out evolution. We just need to admit it might not be the whole story. And once you allow that, once you stop calling vast portions of yourself junk, another question slips in through the side door. If there is a signature in our biology, if something about us developed differently, then the real mystery isn't whether someone visited. It's what exactly they left behind, and whether we're finally old enough to notice. The code behaves strangely. This is where things get quiet, not louder, not flashier, just harder to dismiss. Because the deeper scientists go into DNA, the less it behaves like a messy byproduct of chance, and the more it behaves like something with intentional structure. Not intention we can point to, But intention we can feel, the way you feel it when a system keeps working long after you stop understanding it. So let's walk through this carefully. No declarations. No conclusions. Just observations that keep raising their eyebrows. Subsection A. Regulatory intelligence. Remember that junk DNA we talked about? The stuff we assumed was just genetic clutter? Here's what it actually does. It doesn't build proteins. It doesn't form muscles or bones. It decides. It decides when genes turn on, when they turn off, how strongly they express, how long they stay active. It responds to environment, to stress, to nutrition, to trauma, especially in 3 places: the brain, the immune system, early development. My line, it doesn't build the machine. It decides when the machine wakes up. That's not trivial. That's orchestration. Without these regulatory regions, the genome wouldn't just malfunction. It would collapse into noise. Genes would fire at the wrong time. Cells would grow where they shouldn't. Development would lose sequence. This isn't spare wiring. It's the conductor. And conductors don't make sound themselves. They make everything else make sense. Which already makes the word junk feel embarrassed. Subsection B. Sudden brain expansion. Now let's talk about something even stranger. The human brain. For most of evolutionary history, brain size increases slowly, gradually, painfully, in tiny increments tied to survival pressure. Then something happens. Between roughly 2 million and 200,000 years ago, the human brain triples in size. Fast. Too fast. Faster than anatomy can comfortably keep up with. Our skulls barely manage the size. Childbirth becomes dangerous. Energy demands skyrocket. And yet the brain keeps growing. Ask the soft question. Why? What survival pressure demanded abstract thought? Symbolism, music, mathematics, self-reflection? You don't need philosophy to hunt. You don't need imagination to gather fruit. So why did thinking accelerate faster than survival demanded? Evolution explains that it happened. It struggles with why it happened so aggressively, especially when the advantages didn't show up immediately. This looks less like gradual optimization and more like a system being unlocked. Subsection C. The Rh-negative anomaly. Now let's slow down even more. This part makes people uncomfortable, not because it's explosive, but because it doesn't resolve neatly. Rh-negative blood type. Rare. Unevenly distributed. Genetically odd. It lacks a protein most humans share. Its inheritance patterns don't fully align with known evolutionary paths. Important pause. This isn't proof of anything. It's not about superiority. It's not about purity. It's not about destiny. My tone. This isn't proof of anything. It's a raised eyebrow. A biological footnote that doesn't quite fit the story we like telling. Difference without a clear lineage. And in science, unexplained differences don't scream answers. They whisper questions. Subsection D. Digital patterns in biology. Now comes the part that quietly ties everything together. DNA doesn't behave like mud, it behaves like software. It stores information digitally, it uses error correction. It compresses data, it includes redundancy. It copies itself with astonishing fidelity and flags mistakes. This isn't poetic metaphor, it's literal. Biologists routinely use terms like code, transcription, translation, editing, repair, because there are no better words. My reflection. DNA doesn't behave like mud. It behaves like software. And here's the thought experiment that refuses to stay in its box. If you found a structure like this on another planet, digital encoding, layered regulation, error correction, metadata controlling execution, what would you assume? Not who built it, just what kind of thing it is. We don't have to say design. We don't have to say designer. We only have to admit this: the deeper we look, the less accidental it feels, not magical, not supernatural, just deliberate in a way we're not used to seeing without a mind behind it. And that's where the discomfort starts to creep in. Because if our biology contains layers we didn't evolve into slowly, if something about us was accelerated, nudged, or structured differently, then the question shifts again. Not did someone interfere, but what were we being prepared for? And that question doesn't belong to the past. It belongs uncomfortably close to the present, to a species on the edge of editing its own code, still arguing about whether it understands the book it's about to rewrite. Not a name, not a logo. Let's be careful here. Not careful because the idea is dangerous, but because it's easy to misunderstand. When people hear genetic signature, they imagine something obvious: a watermark, a hidden sentence, a cosmic brand name stamped into our cells. That's not what this is. There's no message that says "made by," no alien autograph tucked between chromosomes, no instruction that reads like a letter. If there is a signature at all, it's quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself, it waits. Think of it this way. A signature doesn't always say who made something. Sometimes it just says, this can become more, not a blueprint, not a destiny, capacity, potential, latent ability. A signature doesn't have to say who made something. Sometimes it just says, this can become more. And when you step back and look at the pattern we've been following, the shape starts to feel familiar. First, the help was external. Tools that shouldn't exist, machines left behind, knowledge seeded into early cultures. Then the structures became planetary. Networks of stone, global alignments, infrastructure that outlived language. Then the message shifted again, away from matter entirely. Philosophical guidance, ethical framing, stories about growth, restraint, and maturity. And now, here we are. No new tools, no new stones, no new visitors, just us. And a genome that behaves less like a random byproduct and more like a system designed to scale, a brain that outpaced survival needs, regulatory code that responds to experience, a species capable of self-reflection and now self-editing. Which raises a question that feels almost too quiet for how big it is. What if the final gift wasn't technology, but possibility? What if the goal was never to give us answers, but to give us the capacity to eventually ask the right questions? Not instructions carved into rock. Instructions written into us. That wouldn't violate free will. It wouldn't guarantee outcomes. It wouldn't even prove intent. It would simply make one thing true: that humanity isn't static, we're not finished. And if there's a signature, it wouldn't force our hand. It would do something far more unsettling. It would leave the choice entirely up to us. Which brings us to the final turn of this chapter. Because if something was placed inside us not as control, but as potential, then the most important question isn't where it came from. It's what happens when a species finally realizes it's holding the pen to its own instruction manual. The weight of meaning. There's a reason this idea makes people shift in their seats. It's not because it's threatening. It's because it's heavy. We like being accidental. Accidents come with forgiveness built in. If everything is random, then outcomes are just outcomes. No one expected anything more. My observation: if we're random, failure is forgivable. If we're intentional, that's a heavier story. Because intention implies expectation. It suggests that our intelligence, our creativity, our empathy weren't just lucky side effects. They were possible for a reason. And that raises uncomfortable questions about how we use them. Science, to its credit, is careful here. This framing isn't easily testable. It isn't falsifiable yet. And it's dangerously easy to twist into something ugly. History has shown what happens when people confuse mystery with hierarchy. So let's be clear. This is not destiny, not superiority, not a prophecy about where humanity should go. It doesn't say some people matter more than others. It doesn't rank worth or value. It doesn't excuse cruelty or control. It says something much smaller and much harder to misuse if handled honestly. That there may be more to us than we've accounted for. That our story might be unfinished by design, not decree. An open question, written very quietly. And perhaps that's why it unsettles us. Because open questions don't let us relax. They don't let us declare the story over. They ask us to live like our choices might actually matter, not because someone is watching, but because something within us is still waiting to be understood. The gift you don't open yet. Let's make it small one last time. Imagine someone gives you a box. They don't tell you what's inside. They don't tell you when to open it. They just say, not yet. So you carry it, you grow up, you learn things. You make mistakes. You figure out how not to break what you touch. And one day, quietly, you realize you're ready. My reflection: maybe evolution isn't finished with us. Because it was never meant to rush. Maybe the long pauses in our history weren't delays. Maybe they were patience if we carry potential. If consciousness is the real measure. If interference stopped once we could stand on our own. Then a new question steps into the room. Not did someone come here? But why don't we see them now? Because if observation replaced intervention, if silence followed instruction, if the training wheels came off, then what we're experiencing might not be absence. It might be expectation. And that leads us into the next chapter. Because once you start asking why the sky went quiet, you have to ask whether it ever truly did. Whether human DNA holds a signature, a scaffold, or simply a remarkable accident, it leaves us with a quiet, unsettling thought that humanity may not be incomplete by mistake, but unfinished by design.